that I'm recording this. So we don't broadcast it live on Zoom anymore because it's just really too confusing to try to answer questions from there and in the room. So we record it and then we upload it to YouTube afterwards. All that to say, you got to be on your best behavior, because otherwise what you say is going to be recorded and will go out to the wider world there. Well, no, we both need to be on our best behavior. Tell you what, I'll keep an eye on you, Doug. You keep an eye on me, and we'll see how we get through this, okay? Perfect. Well, come on in. You may, if you're sitting in the back, you may want to, there are going to be a couple of different times tonight. Yeah, I was talking to you, Dan, where you're gonna need to interact with at least one other person and kind of read some text and talk about stuff together. So you don't want to be isolated all by yourself. Like, we're a warm, friendly group, so I'm sure somebody will welcome you in. But thank you guys for being here. I'm glad you could be here tonight. The goal of these studies is to, like the title says, just to go deeper into the text in a way that hopefully involves more of an opportunity for questions. I certainly don't know everything. In conversation, Sunday morning sermons are very kind of one-way conversations. So this is more of an opportunity to have more communication and ask questions. And we're going to be in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, these two letters, for quite a while, like at least until Easter, maybe some beyond that. So it's good to spend more time, particularly on the background. So what I thought we would do, I haven't decided if this is the only deep dive in the series, if we'll do more as we go, or we're just playing it by ear. But tonight I thought it would be good for us to spend some time talking a little bit more about the author of these letters, Paul, and kind of how his life uniquely prepared him to be the one who reaches out to the Corinthians and all that's involved in that. And then piecing together what we can figure out about the audience, the people in Corinth, and then a little bit more about kind of the history that they have together and what their relationship is like. And one of the reasons that for us as a church, as we've been thinking and praying about what we're going to study, one of the reasons we really want to spend some time in these texts is because the 1st and 2nd Corinthians have lots and lots of practical topics that I think can help our church grow in our relationship with Christ, but also help us know how to reach out to the world around us that's in the midst of lots of cultural changes and transitions. And I really think the more I dug into it and thought about it, there's a lot of parallels between the 1st century Corinth and 21st century Corvallis, which is, what we were trying to communicate with the artwork for that. Like eventually we realized, like, hey, they have the same first 3 letters. Like, maybe we can do something there. So that idea is that really, I think I mentioned this in the opening sermon in this series, no book of the Bible was written to us. There is no first Suburban in there anywhere. But I think 1st and 2nd Corinthians might be about as close as we can get in terms of some of the issues that we're dealing with today. So in addition to that, as we go through this, also there's a number of really, really wonderful resources that are out there with 1st and 2nd Corinthians that you can point to as individuals, or if you're part of a group that's studying together that can help them with that. So if you want to engage in a deeper study, and in fact, if somebody wants to help, I've got some handouts. I think might not be enough for everybody, but there's definitely enough for every pair to have some. Right, David, could I tap you or somebody to help as well? Maybe each pick a side. So we'll go over this a little bit more in depth later, but basically one side of it just kind of has some general introductions to 1st Corinthians and 2nd Corinthians. And then the other side just has some resources to be aware of, whether that's books or commentaries or some things that are online as well that can help with that. So by way of introduction, I just want to read you all kind of a little, as I was sitting down and thinking about this series, why do we want to talk about this now? This is kind of a little description of the series that we wrote up. So it says, what we know as the biblical books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians really aren't books at all. Instead, they're letters. They were letters that were into real people who were facing real problems. Those people were new followers of Jesus who just weren't quite getting it right. They were mixing their new faith and their new values with the old ways of thinking and acting that they carried into the church with them from the past, from the way that they had grown up thinking. And when they do that, it leads to real problems, problems that turn into arguments and controversies that threaten to tear this new church apart. So even though Paul wrote this letter 2,000 years ago, it really does apply very directly to our modern world. So in this series, we're going to look at what we can figure out about the history and culture of the city of Corinth, so we can better understand what Paul said and how it applies to us as we're trying to follow Jesus here in the heart of the valley today. So if you look at the handout there at the bottom of the page, there's one page that says resources to be aware of. At the bottom, there's some homework. Okay, so this is optional. You don't have to do any of this if you don't want to. But this is some things I would encourage you to do as we go through this series, because I think it will give you a little bit more of a background and enrich that for you. First off, if you're not aware of them, the Bible Project, which is this nonprofit out of Portland that makes tools for biblical study, they do these introductory videos on their overviews of each book of the Bible. They're maybe 9 or 10 minutes long. They have one of those for 1 Corinthians and for 2 Corinthians. You can just Google Bible Project 1 Corinthians and video pop up. They're great. They're not the be all end all, but they're kind of a helpful, short, concise way to get a quick overview, kind of the 30,000 foot view of the book and how it's structured and the themes that it talks about. So those are great. I'd encourage you to watch those if you haven't. I would encourage you to read the books of 1 and 2 Corinthians regularly if you haven't done that often lately. I'd encourage you to read them in multiple translations. Maybe read them through the NIV, and then you go back and you read it in the Message or the NASB or something. You can actually buy, or you can go to certain websites like Bible Gateway. I think you can put different translations next to each other and read. Or you can buy like editions of the New Testament that have 4 or 5 different translations next to each other. Sometimes it's helpful just to, when you see how certain verses get translated in different ways, sometimes it points you back to be like, oh, there must be something interesting going on in the original text there. But definitely read them for yourselves. And then there's a couple of sections in Acts that we're going to look at tonight that I would also encourage you to read and study on your own. Acts 18 tells the story of Paul's time in Corinth, so that's a good thing to be familiar with. And then in Acts 22, Paul's actually on trial, and he gives a little bit of his biography, which we'll look at tonight when we're trying to get a little bit more of a background on him. So those are great things for you to be reading and digging into on your own that I think can really help enrich your study of 1 and 2 Corinthians as we go through that in the sermons. So 1 Corinthians, right? It's a letter from Paul to a group of Christians in the Roman city of Corinth. And in it, he's continuing a conversation that he's had with them about problems that are going on. And with letters, again, we tend to look at the books of the Bible and think, well, it's the Bible, it's a book, right? But it started its life out as a letter. And whenever you're reading a letter or you get an email or something, it's always good to try to think, well, who wrote it? And, that whole who, what, when, where, why, all those kinds of things. So the first thing we're going to do is do a little bit of work on the who, right? Especially on the author, like we know that Paul wrote this. So what I want you to do is I want you to get in pairs or groups of 3 or whatever works best. And if you look on that resources to be aware of sheet, it says Acts 22 verses 1 through 5 and verses 26 through 29. So this is Paul. He's on trial and he's kind of telling his life story. So what I want you to do is take just a couple of minutes in pairs and read those verses. And then just together, like list out everything you can think of that tells you about Paul. Like, what do you know about Paul and his life and his background just based on what you read there? So we're just going to take a few minutes to do that. I'm going to pause the recording so that the people online don't have to just watch. Help me try to remember to start this again, by the way. So take just 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll circle back and kind of see what you've come up with. Okay, let's pull back together. So again, we don't have to have an exhaustive biography of Paul by any chance. Oh, I forgot. I have slides tonight. I did. Thank you. Here he is, the man of the hour. There's Paul, just so that we know who it is we're talking about. So what did you learn about Paul from what Paul reflected on himself? So he's born in Tarsus in Cilicia. Yeah. He's a Roman citizen. Okay, so he's a Roman citizen. He's born in the city of Tarsus, which is in Asia Minor, so modern day Turkey, and was actually like a real center for Greek culture. So he's born in Tarsus, Roman citizen. What else do we know about him? He's Jewish, right? So religiously, he's Jewish. Okay. Anything to add to that as far as his Jewish upbringing? Yeah, so he's not just religiously Jewish, he has a very intense religious formation and training under Gamaliel, who's kind of one of the well-known, highly regarded rabbis of the day.
He put people in prison.
Yeah, he wasn't always a Christian, right? At first, he was pretty opposed to the church, and he was throwing people in prison and all of that. So there's been a pretty dramatic shift in his life from his view on Christianity. Well, yeah, you get knocked to the ground, it gives you a pretty dramatic change in things. So he was connected to the high priest, that was said, Doug? Oh, yes, his position, I mean, he's not just like a rank and file guy, like in the religious structure of the day, he's way up there. Yeah, so it's interesting, like one of the things that I think it's important to think about with Paul is a lot of times when people talk about Paul and why he was so uniquely suited to be kind of this person who reached out beyond the Jewish world with the message of Jesus, is they talk about the three strands of his identity, and you guys hit on all of those. So religiously, Paul was Jewish, right? And he had the training that went along with that. So he was the child of Orthodox Jewish parents. He's probably sent to Jerusalem at an early age to study with this notable teacher, Gamaliel, became a Pharisee, and kind of at one point he says, I was like top of my class in Pharisee school, I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And as you'll see, that the fact that he has that Jewish background influences his strategy as a missionary. When he shows up in a new town, almost always the first place he goes is to the synagogue, right? Because Christianity and the life Jesus was Jewish, grew out of the work that God had done through the Jewish people. So he often has started there. So Paul is not a slouch. Like Paul knew the law, like as somebody who would have been trained in this, he probably had most of the Old Testament memorized, like the whole Torah, the first 5 books for sure. And if you read Paul's letters, like you see that, because sometimes Paul quotes like, as Isaiah says, but a lot more often, like he's just kind of riffing on stuff. Like he mentions something that's not a direct quote from somewhere in the Old Testament, but it's clearly an allusion and a reference to that. Like somebody once described Paul and John, who wrote the book of Revelation. They had scripture saturated minds. Like they just knew the scripture so well, it just sort of flows out in all these different ways. So that's one part of who Paul is, right? He's got this Jewish religious background. But culturally, he is a Greek. He's a Hellenistic Greek. So he was born in Tarsus in Asia Minor, which was really a center of Hellenistic. So Hellenistic is just a term that talks about like the broader Greek influence in the world. Like the Romans are in charge politically, but the culture is still very much shaped by the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. Like, so the Greek ideals of truth and beauty and art, they're still very much prevalent in the Roman world. So Paul, and if again, you read some of his other letters, Paul knew Greek philosophy. Paul knew Greek poetry. Like in Acts 17, when he's in Athens, he quotes Greek poets back to the people who were there at the philosophy school to try to sort of use what the poet says to communicate the truth about the gospel. If you read Paul and the way he structures his letters, it is very clear to people who know more than me that Paul has had an excellent education in Greek rhetoric and the art of how to make effective arguments. So you can go and find like first century rhetoric books, like when they would teach people how to put a public speech together. And Paul, like he follows the outlines that are in there that Cicero and other people have. In fact, that you notice if you read in 2 Corinthians, they say, you see this in the letter, and at one point they're talking about him and they say, Paul is really weighty in his writing. Like he structures things well, but he's not all that impressive as a public speaker. When he actually gets up to deliver the material, it's like a C+ at best, right? He's not a good speaker, but in terms of the rhetoric and the training that he has, it's there. So if you think about it, Paul's education in Tarsus and in Jerusalem puts him in like the upper 1 to 2% of people in his world in terms of education. Like only a very, very limited minority of families could give their child, Paul, the education that he received. So religiously, he's Jewish and he's got all the background in that, the education. Culturally, he's Greek and he understands the Greek world and philosophy. He's got the education in there too. But politically, he's a Roman citizen, as he pointed out, right? Which is interesting because at that time, Jews were not usually granted Roman citizenship. They were in the empire, but they didn't usually have that right. So the theory is, like there's a guy, a scholar named Ben Witherington, that his family somewhere along the line must have provided some service to the empire. His guess is that because Paul is a tent maker by profession, like maybe Paul's family made tents for the Roman army or something like that, and they were rewarded with citizenship as a result of that. But politically, Paul has this, he's got this trump card, right? He's a Roman citizen. And when you read like in the book of Acts, you realize that like he's not afraid to use that trump card at times. Like he's about to get arrested and he's like, hey, is it illegal for you to do that to a Roman citizen? And everybody's like, whoa, okay, hold on, back off, right? So he's got some power because of that. And if you think about it, because of that, he's able to take advantage of the Roman roads and the Roman justice system. So his citizenship really gives him access to the whole Mediterranean world, and it offers him protection sometimes when he runs into trouble in these different places. So in just a minute, if I could get a volunteer to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I'm going to have you read a couple verses in just a minute. So who wants to turn there and get ready for that? This is the volunteer participation portion of the evening. Lillian's going to do it, thanks. So Lillian, you're going to read verses 20 through 23 of 1 Corinthians 9. So before we listen to what Paul says here, just think about what's going on. So by the time Paul sits down and writes this letter, 1 Corinthians, he's been a Christian for probably 20 years, something like that. And he's mature, and he's been fully engaged as a missionary in missionary work for more than a decade. And these three different strands of his background, right? The Jewish religion, the Greek culture, the Roman political citizenship, all three of those things have been impacted and transformed by his discipleship to Jesus. And they turn into tools that he uses on his missionary journey. So his broad background makes him an ideal apostle to reach out to the Greek-speaking world, to go, man, think about how much better somebody like Paul is going to be received than someone like Peter. And it's nothing against Peter. He was a fantastic leader in the early church. But Peter was an uneducated fisherman from a bupkis little town in the backwater of the Roman Empire. So like he's not going to have the same sort of cultural entrance that Paul has in other places. He's not going to be able to get the hearing that Paul's going to get in other places. So Lillian, if you could read those verses for us, that would be great. Yeah, 20 through 23 of 1 Corinthians chapter 9.
To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings.
Yeah, so you might be familiar with that passage, to the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jew, to the Greeks, I become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might win some. Well, I think that has a little bit more weight to it when you stop and think about all these different dimensions of Paul's background and his training and his education and what he's had. And I think one of the things that you see, it really does inform the way he engages with different people differently. He's able to engage with a lot of different people on their terms, on terms they can understand, to communicate the unchanging truth of the gospel. And this is one of those, just kind of a little pastoral side note. One of the things that I love about this is God doesn't waste our background, right? Wherever we are, whatever experience that we've had, whether that's before we met Jesus or not, God doesn't waste any of that. He's able to use that to uniquely position and prepare us for what he's calling us to do. And all of this served Paul really well when he kind of stepped into his calling as a Christian missionary. And anyway, if that's something that you've never stopped and thought about in your own life, I would encourage you to stop and reflect on that. Just think about your own life and how has God used everything you've gone through, good or bad, whether you chose it or not. Like God has a really amazing way of using those things to open up the doors that he wants us to walk through. Any thoughts on that or examples of that? Anything that somebody might want to share around that in their life or in somebody else's life? I mean, I've shared this in sermons before with the dumb example. Like I was a Spanish major in college, and the only reason I chose Spanish is because it was the shortest major. Like it had the fewest required hours and I could graduate sooner. I was going to go to grad school in English. They didn't care what my degree was in. It didn't have to be in English. They just said, you have to have a degree. So I was like, well, great, I can get out of here earlier this way. So I was like, that is the entire reason that I was a majored in Spanish. And then like 3 weeks after I graduated, I met Martha, who grew up in this Spanish-speaking country, Chile. And I'm like, oh, yes, Lord, now I see you work in mysterious ways. And, I'm like, all right, whatever. But then a couple of years later, we found ourselves moving to Chile to work as missionaries there. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I don't think like God led me to major in Spanish, like I was just a dumb 19-year-old kid, or whatever. But God's able to use the different things that we experience to help prepare us for what he has for us. So So that's Paul. There's brother Paul, the Jewish Greek Roman mix, who's sort of uniquely situated to do this work and write this letter. So next, let's talk a little bit about what Corinth was like, the city of Corinth in that day. So if you can, go ahead and turn in your Bible to Acts chapter 18. If you're not familiar with it, though, again, we got some more pictures. So this is modern day Greece. Over there on the right, that's modern day Turkey. And Greece, it has that unique shape. There's a big part of the top, there's a little peninsula at the bottom, and then there's this like tiny little strip of land that connects the two pieces of it. And the city of Corinth is right on that tiny little strip of land. It's called the Isthmus of Corinth. And one of the reasons so there was an ancient city in Corinth several hundred years before Paul showed up. And the Romans destroyed it in the year 146 BC. As they were taken over from the Greek Empire, they just completely laid waste to the city. And about 100 years later, Caesar ordered that the city should be rebuilt because he's like, that's a pretty strategic spot right there. Shipping routes, like we should probably have a presence there. So he decided to have the city rebuilt, and he rebuilt it as a Roman town. So it's laid out like a Roman town, and he needed some people to live there. So he got a bunch of ex-Roman soldiers to live there. This is actually a fairly common practice. One of the ways that they would pay soldiers is by like giving them land in a city over there, because the Romans didn't want them in Rome. They didn't want a whole bunch of people with military training hanging around the capital with not much to do, because that led to revolutions and things they didn't like. But they're like, yeah, over in Greece, we'll give you 50 acres over there if you want to move over there. So you have this city that's growing up, and it's a way of, it's lots of people that are Roman, but there's a lot of Greeks in the area as well. So by the time Paul shows up, it's around the year 80, 50, 51. So the city's been rebuilt for about 100 years. There's somewhere between 50 and 80,000 people there. So it's Corvallis with or without the OSU students, more or less, kind of that size town. So it's located right on this isthmus. There's a harbor on both sides of it, and it became a really important trade route. Part of the reason why is, so that arrow at the bottom, right? That's the shipping route that you had to take to go around Greece. At that day, people didn't sail like across the Mediterranean because there was no radar or anything. You stayed pretty close to the shore because that didn't sail. But that's a really, I don't know anything about sailing, but from what the books say, like that's a pretty treacherous stretch of land there, or that of sailing there. The weather was often bad. A lot of times ships would wreck, and it took about 6 days to get around that. So sometimes people would risk that. Other times what they would do is they would just kind of park it on one side of that little isthmus in Corinth. There's Quincrae was the city over there, and they would just pay to unload everything, move it 4 miles across that little isthmus and load onto another ship. Or they actually had a road that was built where if the ship wasn't too big, they'd pull the whole ship out of the water, put it on wooden rollers, and just roll it across and plop it in the ocean on the other side. And either way, when that happened, they got taxes to do that. So they're making money off of that. This is more of a modern map. So you see Corinth there on the left. That's the current modern day city of Corinth. Ancient Corinth was down and to the left a little bit of that, but you can still, and actually one of the things you see that Corinth Canal, they eventually I think it was in the late 1890s, they decided that hauling ships on rollers wasn't a good idea anymore. So they actually just put a canal in. So now ships can just go through there. But the older city of Corinth, you can still go and visit the ruins today. So there's that big hill in the back. It's called the Acro-Corinth. That's the name of that hill. And just down from that is the ruins of the ancient city of Corinth. There's still a bunch of ruins of temples and the forum and things like that that you can go and see. In fact, I found this online. This is a 3D geographical, topographical map, which I think is interesting because you see the mountains and all that. You kind of see that little flat part of the isthmus where they could come in at the port of Quincrae, they could go across, see where the modern canal is. And then, so modern Corinth is, again, a little north of where the ancient ruins are, and then you see the mountain there. So Corinth at the time was well known for a number of things. One of the things it was really well known for was temple prostitution. So in fact, the Greek word for, if you call someone a Corinthian girl, it was a slang word for being a loose woman. So that was kind of the reputation that the city had. It's not all that different from ports of call for navies today, right? Got some Navy veterans in the back. The Burns are kind of sketchy folks, but ships where sailors are frequently in, they often have a reputation for that kind of thing. So for sure. And it was a very well-developed city. So even if you think about the comparison to Corvallis today, so there was a theater, like a public theater in ancient Corinth that they think sat about 18,000 people. Does anybody know what the capacity of Gill Coliseum is? It's about 9,000. Okay, so this is twice the number of people that you can fit into Gill, like when they're packed out for the OU game or something. That's how many people they could fit in that stadium. There was a concert hall that sat about 3,000. The main auditorium in the LaSalle Center seats 1,200. So again, it's a developed city with some real resources. And when Paul arrives there, it's a city on the rise. Like it's growing in fame and power. It's becoming richer. It's growing in civic pride. So there are all sorts of construction projects that people would give money to in order to attach their name to it, to build up their own honor and their public reputation. So the number of inscriptions, archaeologists go and they dig stuff up, or, somebody decides they want to build a house and they start digging down the foundation and they find these ruins. So they call archaeologists in. It is insane the number of public inscriptions that they have found there that have survived in archaeology that have been like, oh, Flerbius built this aqueduct, to show what a great model citizen he was. There's just tons of that because again, that's what people are doing in Corinth. They're making a name for themselves. They're trying to build themselves up. It's an honor shame culture. Those are kind of the key values. So anything you can do to build up your honor and your status that moves you ahead, that's a good thing. Self-promotion was a huge deal back then. And again, when you start reading the letters to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you kind of see how some of these ideas from the culture, because again, the people who are in the church, they've spent the first 40 years of their life in this culture, and then they meet Paul, and 18 months later, Paul leaves and they're in this church. So they've got 40 years forming them according to these values, and a pretty short period of time trying to be reformed according to the values of Jesus. So a lot of them, they just bring in their old way of doing stuff into the church, and it ends up causing all sorts of problems. This is a very proud, this is why I put this one in here. So it was a very proudly Roman city. So one of the things that they did is they held what was known as the Isthmian Games. I guess that comes from the word isthmus. Isthmus, by the way, not an easy word to say 3 times fast. There's lots of consonants together that shouldn't be there. But you guys, we know the Olympic Games, right? They were held in Athens. We have the modern Olympics. The Isthmian Games were sort of second in scale only to the Olympics. So this is a really big deal when these events were held. So it brought a lot of people to Corinth. Again, archaeologists have found coins from that era from all over the world that indicate that people traveled a great distance to get to Corinth to be there for the games. So they're really trying to kind of make their name as a Roman city. So lots of entertainment, economic boom times are happening. The city is on the rise. Okay, so that's the background that Paul shows up in. So would somebody read Acts 18 verses 1 through 3, just the first 3 verses out loud so that everybody can hear it? Yeah, go for it. Thank you, Gil.
They have a Jew named Lydia, a native of Pontus, recently uneducated with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to leave Rome. And he went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade.
So Paul shows up in Corinth, and he lands with some people that he ends up meeting, Aquila and Priscilla. They're also Christians, and like him, they're all tent makers, so they're kind of in business together. So immediately he has some work to do. He can start living with a trade, start earning some money doing tent making. This is actually, if you've ever heard that expression for somebody who is in ministry, but they have a secular job to pay the bills, that's often called tent making. The idea that I want to give my time and effort to ministry, but I'm working at the phone company to pay the bills so that I can do it. That's where that expression comes from. But for Paul, that was really important, particularly in Corinth. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, because it meant that he could support himself, and he didn't owe anybody any favors. He wasn't being supported by other people, which was a real issue in this town. So Paul is doing that. And again, it's this upwardly mobile colony. It's very competitive. It's interesting. Corinth was the first Greek colony, first Greek city to host Roman gladiatorial style contests. Like you've seen Gladiator or Gladiator 2, which I haven't seen yet, but it's out. So they were one of the first cities outside of Rome to sort of do that. I mean, they're channeling that, like that level of competition, we're going to have people kill each other here, so that's what they're all about. So, okay, what we're going to do now, we're going to get back in groups again, and you can be in the same group or shift it around. We're going to take a couple minutes. And what I want you to do is read the first 8 verses of Acts chapter 18. And just kind of, if you can, and again, I'll pause the recording and come back on so that people, if they're watching online, they can pause and do this for themselves. But just think, okay, when Paul gets to the city, he finds a place to live, he starts working. What did he do after that? What was the progression that he went through? Who did he talk to? After that, who else did he talk to? And how would you describe his relationship with the Corinthian believers based on this passage? So take a couple minutes, think about that. All right, let's come back together. So thank you. I remember this time. I don't usually, but I did this time. So what'd you learn? So what's Paul do first? So he sets up shop, he's making some tents, he's got a little spending money. Where does he go from there? He preaches on the weekends. To whom? Yeah, so he starts out preaching in the synagogue, right? So there's a Jewish population there in the city, and he goes and he starts teaching there. And he like converts like the chairman of the board basically of their synagogue, and he becomes a Christian. And then from there, he ends up going and basically talking to anybody who will listen. So the Gentile people who don't have a Jewish background. Then he gets in some trouble, right? Because the people who were in the synagogue who didn't want to go along with it, or everybody's leaving, so they bring him in front of this guy Gallio, who's sort of the Roman official in charge of justice. Let's just love it. He's basically like, I'm not dealing with this stuff. Like, you guys figure it out, So Paul is like, yeah, and he walks out, and this poor Sosthenes guy, they just beat the synagogue leader for no reason. They're just so anyway. So people are interesting. Yeah.
Took out his arm, which I kind of understand. Why does he say it blood on your own heads?
Okay, let me pull
It
that.
seems like he was sort of angry. I think it fit.
Gallio was,
No.
or
Verse 6.
okay, hold on a second. I told you guys to turn there. Well, Paul is an interesting guy. When they opposed and insulted him, he shook the dust from it, but your blood is on your own heads. From now on, I'm going to preach to the Gentiles. Paul has got a little bit of a fiery personality. And it's a little bit like when I got baptized as a kid, like one of my feet popped up, like when Pastor Fred was like 6'7", and I was a kid at the time. So there's this real height differential, right? And something about the angle, one of my feet popped out of the water. So the way I've thought about that is like, there's a little piece of me that never quite got redeemed. And it still shows up sometimes. And you see some of the things that Paul does and some of the things he says, especially when he gets fired up, like you ever read the book of Galatians? There are these people who are coming in to Gentile believers saying, oh, well, you need to be circumcised. And Paul's like, man, I wish the people who were saying that would just go and basically castrate themselves. And you're like, whoa, Paul, okay, maybe just take it down a notch. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is to that besides, maybe Paul was just tired and wanted to be doing something else and was a little cranky.
Culture that they relate to.
Maybe so. That would be something to, if you want to study that and figure out, let me know what you find out. I'd love to hear your findings on it.
Paul talked with a bazillion Jews up at this point. What triggered that at that point he said, forget it, just forget the whole thing. I'm gonna go to the non-Jews. What triggered that now?
Well, I think typically he's probably not welcome in the synagogue anymore after this. So he doesn't have that option. He's like, well, they'll probably beat me if I show up there again, which, Paul was not averse to taking a beating. But Paul also understood that his mission, the way he understood his mission, was a mission to the Gentiles. And the way that he often went through that was by starting with Jewish people and God-fearers, which was a technical term for people who were not Jew. They never converted to Judaism, but they were learning about the God of the Hebrew people. So he would kind of start where there was a common base of knowledge around the Old Testament, but he never stopped there. Like that was for him always just the first step in living out the mission to reach out to the Gentile believers. And that's what he does, right? So he's like, fine, he left and he went to the home of Titius Justus, a Gentile who worshiped God. That's one of those God-fearers. He's right next door to the synagogue, though. That's the best part. He's like, fine, I'm just gonna go next door, right, and move on here. And lots of people begin to fall. So then what Paul ends up doing is he gathers them together into these house churches, right? So again, see if I can get this slide to come up. There we go. So this is an artist interpretation of sort of a typical Roman house at that time. So this is probably similar to what you would have had in Corinth. Like, they're not huge, right? These are not 5,000 square foot McMansions or something like that with 87 bedrooms, and although it does look like it kind of has a pool. But you could probably get about 40 or 50 people there for a church gathering. So like rooms like the one that we're in today, like when it was time for the Corinthian church service, they didn't do anything like this. Like, they were not all together. There were different groups that were meeting in homes. Often probably wealthier people had a home that they could open up and do that kind of thing. So, Paul, he starts bringing people together, and they start meeting in these house churches. And it's interesting because we can date the time that Paul was in Corinth with a little bit more accuracy than we can with some of the other elements in the New Testament, because he mentions, right, that he's put on trial before Gallio, who was the proconsul. So other records outside of the Bible, extra biblical records, tell us that Gallio only served in that post for 2 years, 51 and 52 AD. So, and this is actually an inscription that they found in Corinth. It has his name, talks about him. So if you can read Greek, so kind of in the middle, down a little bit, there's a sigma, if you're familiar with like fraternity letters and stuff. And just to the right of that, there's the gamma's kind of worn out, but there's an A and an L. The lambdas are like upside down V's, and then O. So that's his name, Gallio, that's there. And that was something that they found in Corinth that kind of points back to this other Roman record that he was there at that time. So if he was there between 51 and 52 AD, and Acts 18 tells us that Paul was in Corinth for 18 months, and then at some time shortly after that, he's on in Ephesus planning a church, and he hears about the news happening in Corinth, he probably wrote the letter around 54 or 55, something like that, based on that. Interestingly enough, another thing, if you get to the very end of Romans, so the end of the book of Romans chapter 16, which I think he wrote from Corinth, if I remember right. But he mentions this guy Erastus. So in Romans 16:23, let me just pull that up. Yeah, in 16:23, he's sending greetings for all of his friends. Where is that? Yeah, so Gaius says hello to you. He's my host. He serves everyone. He says, Erastus, the city treasurer, sends you his greetings. So that's, again, another post, right? The city treasurer. I can never pronounce it. It's like Aedile, Adile, something like that. But this payment, actually, the translation of this basically says, Erastus paid for this public work as part of his campaign to get the job that Paul says that he has in Acts 16. Because again, or in Romans 16, that's part of the way that people would campaign for jobs, right? They would do public works, they would fix the aqueduct, they would build a road, they would do this thing to kind of show how they were good citizens and raise their honor. So it's interesting. So this tells us a little bit about the makeup of the church in Corinth, right? So it's a mix of Jewish people and Gentile people. A mix of people who have a real strong background in kind of the worship of the one true God and what we think about as sort of Judeo-Christian values. And then people who've got a pagan background, they grew up worshiping all sorts of different gods. You have some people who've got a lot of money, right? Like Erastus has enough money that like he can charge his name into things and say, I did this public works project. And you have a lot of people who probably have nothing. You have people who are free and people who are slaves. You have people with a lot of education, people without education. And there's this mixture of people that are there, and they're all coming together in this church. And one of the things that, again, that's interesting about the culture in Corinth at that time is it really, patronage was a big deal. In fact, one of the resources that I put out on this, like resources to be aware of sheet, is a book called A Week in the Life of Corinth. It's written by a guy named Ben Witherington, who was one of my professors in seminary. And it's actually a fictional story where he's a first century historian and New Testament scholar. So it just kind of tells the story of this slave in Corinth and what would a week of his life been like. But it's interesting because it gets into this idea. It talks about the way that patronage, personal patronage worked, right? The way that you get ahead is by doing favors for people. And when you accept a favor from somebody, you're in their debt, which is why Paul was very careful, at least in Corinth, because the city was so focused on who's getting ahead and who owes who what. He's like, okay, in Corinth, I'm not taking a dime from anybody, right? I'm gonna pay my own way. I'm gonna make my own tents. Like, nobody owns me here. It's interesting because in other cities, like when Paul is in the letter to the Philippians, he talks about how other people are supporting him financially and he's happy to receive it. So it's not like he's always against that, but it's something about the cultural mix of Corinth and what people valued and the way that patronage felt in this reciprocity. He's like, okay, I'm not doing that here. So that would be something for you. It's really, as you read through the books of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, just keep that idea in mind. Because it's interesting in 2nd Corinthians, like Paul does that to like some people use that against him in 2nd Corinthians. Like, well, you must not be much of a teacher because like you don't even take favors from anybody, like you're not even trying to build yourself up, because Paul is operating under a very different definition of leadership than what the world operates under. So this is just one of those things to be aware of as you're reading through the text for yourself. So we know who Paul is. He's got these different facets that make him the right man for the job. We have an idea of what the city of Corinth was like and who all is in the church. So what do we know about the conversation that they had? Could somebody read 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9? It's pretty short. You can just, whoever gets there can just read it out loud.
I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. That was the first one.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. All I wanted you to get was, I wrote to you in my letter. So here's the thing. 1 Corinthians is not the first letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. So 1 Corinthians is the second letter that he wrote to the Corinthians, or at least the second. It's just the first one that we have in the Bible. And do you know why 1 Corinthians is in the Bible before 2 Corinthians? It's not because it was written sooner, although it does happen to actually work that way. It's first because it's longer. Most of the New Testament letters are organized in terms of length as you go through it and some of them together. But so before Paul writes the letter that we're spending our time focusing on and studying, he had apparently written them another letter. So 1 Corinthians 5. So there's another letter that we don't have. That's kind of missing. We don't know what was in there. So Paul, he's there for 18 months. He starts these house churches. He leaves. At some point, he writes them a letter where he's giving them instruction on things. He says, I told you in my other letter not to do this. Well, then things again continue to unravel at the church in Corinth. There's all sorts of problems that come about because of people's different backgrounds, the way they're bringing the world's values in. And Paul finds out about it in a couple of ways. One, like in 1 Corinthians 1, tells us that there's a lady named Chloe who was part of this house church movement. And she sent some people from her household, like, you got to go find Paul in Ephesus and tell him what's going on. So he gets a visitor or visitors from Chloe's household to tell him what's going on. And he also gets a letter from somebody in this church that brings up a number of different issues that apparently were kind of hot button issues. Like, Paul, we need you to weigh in on this. So he writes this letter that's gone, the first letter to the Corinthians. And then we have the second letter, what we know as 1 Corinthians, where he's addressing what he's heard from Chloe's people. And then just kind of going down the list of the things you read through 1 Corinthians, you're like, now about the matters you wrote about, about this matter, about this matter. And he's just kind of bullet point going through answering the questions that they have. Moving down the checklist. And again, these letters they conform to the typical pattern of first century letters at that time. And Paul uses like sort of well-accepted Greek reasoning and logic. He's trying to be persuasive in doing this. He's trying to sort of not say like, look, I'm Paul and I'm telling you, like, do it, get with the program or get out of here, right? He's trying to convince them and persuade them. So he uses Greek rhetorical sort of persuasive techniques. Again, it shows the education that he had. It is interesting, letters in the first century were always considered inadequate, but necessary substitutes for face-to-face conversations. Right? It was always better to talk to somebody face-to-face. So that's why, especially when you read through New Testament letters, Paul often says things like, I long to just be with you so I can talk with you, but I'm in prison, so I can't, or I'm here, so I can't. So I'm sending this letter. The letters were often delivered by somebody who would then read that aloud to the congregation. Actually, interesting side note, most scholars think that people read, even when they were reading to themselves, they read out loud. So, it's like if David sends me an email, I would get it and be like, "Dear Mike, I just wanted to know how you were doing." Like we read to ourselves silently. Apparently, that's not how most people think it happened in the first century. But especially with these public letters, like somebody would bring it and would read it. And typically it was somebody who knew the author, knew what they were trying to convey, and would be able to read it with the right tone of voice and emphasize the right things. And importantly, be able to answer questions about it. I mean, like think about the book of Romans, for example. Has anybody ever read Romans and had a question or two about something? I mean, imagine the original audience probably like, "Whoa, hey, let me stop you right there." So Paul would have sent the letter with somebody who was kind of authorized, like he would have walked through it with him. Here's what I think, to be able to fill in the blanks and answer those questions. Paul's letters are a lot longer than typical first century letters, like way longer. But so there's the lost letter, then there's First Corinthians. And then when you get to Second Corinthians, he refers back to yet another letter, which he calls the severe letter, sometimes called like the letter of tears. So we don't have that one either. So apparently Second Corinthians isn't the second letter, it's probably the fourth letter. And actually some people think Second Corinthians is actually the fourth and fifth letter, because some people argue it was two letters that were actually combined into one. So we think there's two letters, but there's either 4 or 5 letters, a couple of which we have and a couple that we don't have. So all of that just to say, like when you're stepping into the study of these texts, like there's just a lot going on. Like there's a lot of history. It really is. I mean, I always think about it in this way, like when cell phones first came out and like Bluetooth headphones first started to be a thing. I don't know how many times like I would go to the grocery store, and maybe you've had this experience. You're walking down the aisle and somebody is talking and you're like, are you talking to me? And then they look at you like, "Oh, no." And I'm like, "Well, you're looking right at me and you're talking." So then I decided it was really fun. A fun game is to listen to people's conversations and try to reconstruct what's going on the other side of that conversation. Like my favorite one of those, there was this huge church in Tulsa, Victory, at like 8 or 10,000 people. And I stopped by Walmart neighborhood market on the way home to get something for Martha. And I turned the corner and we're on the Jell-O aisle. And Billy Joe Doherty, who was the pastor of this church, he's passed away since then. He's standing at there looking at it. He's on the phone and he's like, "Look, Sharon," who's his wife, "I know you said green Jell-O, but what kind? There's like 47 different kinds of green Jell-O here." So I'm like, "All right, well, clearly she called him, said, 'I need you to pick up green Jell-O on the way home.'" He got there and was like, "I'm lost," right? So you can hear one half of the conversation and try to reconstruct what's going on the other side. And that's part of what we do when we're reading, especially New Testament letters. Like we have the text and we do our best to understand the background and who wrote it, what was going on, what might they have been thinking. But ultimately we have to try to figure out, okay, what's going on the other side of that. So here's a question for you. What do you know of the text? Because again, Paul is writing these letters essentially to help solve problems, to try to, oh, I went too far. To try and correct their wrong thinking and the problems that they're going on. So a lot of you, I know you've probably heard lots of sermons on 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and you've studied these texts for yourself. What comes to mind? What are some of the issues that are going on in this church? What are some of the things that they're dealing with? Yeah, leadership is one of them, right? We talked about that this past Sunday, different definitions of it. Some people are leading in a way to build themselves up, and that's causing division. So that's one of the issues. What else?
Moral issue.
Okay, like what? Moral issues. That's a pretty broad term. All sorts of, well, yeah, and all sorts of sexual problems, right? I mean, you got a guy who's having an affair with his stepmom, and people in the church actually don't think it's a bad idea. They're boasting about it, and you're like, "Oh, well, how does that work?" Then you have people who are still regularly visiting temple prostitutes because they're like, "Hey, I'm free in Christ," and then Paul's like, "That's not exactly what that means." Yeah, so there's all sorts of moral issues going on. Again, because they're just bringing in some of the values from their former life. What else is going on?
Style of the worship service?
Yeah, style of the worship service, right? So their worship services were a mess, right? I mean, you just read through it and sometimes they were clicking and great. Sometimes they were incredibly disorganized and people are yelling over each other. And, there's a real understanding or misunderstanding about spiritual gifts that God gives them. So people are, That's one of the problems. People are looking at these gifts that God gives them. It's not like they did anything to get it, but they're rank ordering them in their mind. Like, oh, well, this gift is better than that. So if I've got this gift, I've got the gift of this, and you only have the gift of mercy. You're like a third class citizen in the church. Like, get back down, so there's like, they can turn anything into a competition, right? Because that's what they knew. That's just what they were good at doing. What other kinds of issues are you aware of in the church?
Disagreements between individuals developing lawsuits.
Oh yeah. They're suing each other in courts, right? And actually, I think Cass is going to be preaching on that in a few weeks. So good luck with that one. No, but Paul's like, oh my gosh, like you've got the spirit of the living God in you, and you can't even figure this out. You've got to go to a secular court. And again, for him, he thinks like, well, what does that do to the reputation of the church? Like, these people don't have anything to offer. I mean, it's like they're going to Judge Judy with everything, right? I mean, it's the church in Corinth, it's a weird mix of like Judge Judy and Jerry Springer. And I mean, there's just all sorts of stuff going on. Yeah. What else? Other ideas that you know of that's going on? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of disagreement about food sacrificed to idols. And then kind of the backstory on that is, animals were sacrificed in these temples to different gods like Zeus and Apollos and all of that, right? Well, what do you think they did with all the leftover meat? Like people didn't eat a lot of meat back then, right? And meat's a good source of protein. You're not going to burn the whole thing for Apollos, and we're not even sure he's real anyway, right? So they would have butcher shops that would open up in these temples, right, to sell the leftover meat. And for some people, they're like, whatever. I mean, these gods are fake anyway, and God made the whole world, so I'm perfectly free to eat this Apollo burger and no issue. But for other people, it was a real, like, you can't eat food that's been sacrificed to another god. It's like you're acknowledging that God is real, and there's only one true God. So there was real debate over that. A nasty debate, like enough that the church is kind of threatening to split up over that.
How they did communion.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one. Lots of issues about communion. So in fact, if you go ahead and do that, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we'll look together at that real briefly. So it's starting in verse 17. So again, Paul's been going down, he's been answering questions for that, and then finally he gets to some, and in some of them, like when he's been talking about different things, he's like, on this particular issue, you guys are like 25% right. I mean, there's a lot to correct, but this thing you've got right. And then he gets to this and he's like, in the following instructions, I can't praise you. It sounds as if more harm than good is done when you meet together. I mean, that's not what you want to hear if you're part of a church. Like, it would be better off for the spiritual growth and life of the people who are in your church if you guys just stopped meeting. Like, yikes. So it says, I hear there's divisions among you when you meet as a church. To some extent, I believe it. Of course, there must be divisions among you so that you who have God's approval will be recognized. This is the New Living Translation. Paul is a sarcastic little booger sometimes. Like, he really is, because he's kind of needling. He's like, oh, there's got to be divisions. So you know which ones of you are more important than the others. And then he says, when you meet together, you're not really interested in the Lord's Supper. For some of you, hurry to meet your own meal without sharing with others. As a result, some go hungry while others get drunk. So interesting. This is a picture. This picture doesn't show up very well. So one of the rooms in that house. So one of the rooms in the house it's called the triclinium, right? So that's like the Roman dining room. In triclinium, right? It's basically, so there's sort of 3 couches and 3 beds. So the best seats at the banquet were at the triclinium, because you would come in and you would kind of recline on that, and you would, as you're like feeding yourself grapes and dates and things like that. But now here's the thing. And again, for a lot of times in the early church, communion wasn't, a little cracker and a little cup, like it's part of a full meal that you have together. So if you can get 50 people in the house church, right? How many of them do you think fit in the triclinium?
15.
Yeah, not 50, right? So who do you think get the best seats? Person who owned the house, right? Yeah, who are the people who can probably get there first because they don't work 14-hour days in the field? Right? that's what a lot of scholars look at this and they're like, okay, so it's the wealthy who are getting there, eating a full meal and actually getting drunk, right? So it's like they're having on like, their third bottle of wine before the rest of the people even get there, and they can't get in. In fact, there's nothing left for them. So Paul is just like, like the Lord's Supper is one of those things that is supposed to remind us of what we have in common in Jesus. And you all are so jacked up that you're even doing that in a way that just highlights division. Like you're doing that in a way that's divisive. That's why he's like, I got nothing good to say about this. When you get together and do this, it does more harm than good. But again, these kinds of divisions were just part and parcel of the society in general, but they run in direct opposition to the message of the gospel and the very nature of what it means to be the church. And in Corinth in particular, there was a lot of boasting and preening and false pride, and those things show up in the letters because people are bringing their culture's values that they learned over their lifetime into the church. So those are just some of the issues that are going on in the church, right? It is one. I think I joked about this in the series, like when Randy and I were talking, like, what do we call this series? I was like, maybe some of Corinthians or Corvallis. He's like, well, we could always just call it "We Could Be Worse." I mean, again, no church is perfect, and when you work in church leadership, you tend to think about the issues and the challenges because that's what you need to address. But I'm like, man, I would like if I were looking for a job. I'm not, by the way. And the first church of Corinth had a senior pastor opening. I would want to steer clear of that one. I'd be like, nah, I don't think so. Cass is interested in ministry. I think she's ready to spread her wings and fly. Like she's ready for that challenge. No, but it's interesting. And then so what we see through the letter is that Paul just continually keeps coming back to, okay, what is the truth of the gospel? And how does the truth of the gospel impact the way you have a meal together, the way you defer to each other when there are issues that are kind of debatable, like should we eat this meat sacrificed to idols or not? How does the truth of the gospel change the way that sexuality is expressed inside the church and outside the church, inside of marriage and outside of marriage? He keeps coming back to, your North Star needs to be the values of Jesus and his kingdom, not the values of Corinth and the Roman Empire. And that's a message we need to hear today too. That the message that our North Star needs to be the values of Jesus and his kingdom, not the values of this city or this state or this country. And that's why I'm like, ooh, yeah. Some of the particulars of this, I'm actually working on a sermon today about 1 Corinthians 5, which is the guy who's sleeping with his mother-in-law. And I'm like, okay, as far as I know, we don't have that specific problem in Suburban. So, if it did, we know how to deal with it because it's out there really clearly. But it's like, okay, we've got our own issues. And how does the overall message of Paul, how does that still translate into our world? Because it really does. And it's funny because like you go down these rabbit trails, like when you should be writing a sermon, but you're researching. So you kind of read and do all this stuff. And I'm like, we don't have any, people sleeping with their mother-in-law in the church. But I mean, I didn't know this. Do you know what one of the most searched for categories of pornographic videos are? Like mother-in-laws. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe the world hadn't changed all that much. At least we're not boasting about it, but apparently lots of people are because they're making a ton of money off of it. So yeah, Doug.
See the Church of Corinth being too much like the church in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And travel around, and as you travel, you visit different churches and so forth. And if you're in a city that's very wealthy, you see that kind of aspect of it. If you're in an area that's rural, in the church there, you see that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, here in the Dallas area, we have a lot of influence in OSU.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of societal influence handed down from the government recently.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get this kind of subliminal messaging that's maybe a little bit counter to the North Star of Christ. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you ever stop and think about it, like it is a little weird that we base our lives in part on letters that were written to people in cities like 8,000 miles from here that most of us are never going to go to. And the details, the particulars are different, but there's something about the truth that's in it and the spirit that's in it that really is applicable in all places, in all situations, in all times. Because like, it doesn't matter where you live, we're all influenced by the culture around us. And it doesn't matter what culture you live in, there are going to be some things in your culture that line up well with the values of the kingdom of God. Like think about the US, right? Like we believe that every person has worth and value, right? That's written in the Constitution, that lines up with the kingdom of God. But no matter what culture you're in, there are going to be some values that run counter to the kingdom of God, right? So you have to figure out like, okay, how do I take what is good and true in my culture's values and embrace that? And then how do I challenge it when it's not true? And every culture is going to have those things. And if it's rural, it might be some things. If it's urban, it might be other things. With the current administration, there are certain things we have to challenge. With whatever the next administration be, there'll be different things that we have to challenge. But like no one political party has, the chokehold on the gospel. Because I don't know if Jesus would have voted for anybody in this last election. Be like, vote for me. Like I would have voted for him. That would have been great. But yeah, that's why I think these letters could be written to us today, and why I think God, through the wisdom of the Holy Spirit, led them to be included in the scripture that we have, that we base our life on, because it reads our mail. And the details may be different, but the underlying things are still there for sure.
So if you had First and Second Corinthians were artificially carved out, they never existed, we would be devoid of a lot of teaching.
Yeah.
I mean, more clarification teaching.
Sure. Yeah, there would definitely be some things we'd be missing. I'm guessing that there's probably not a lot in terms of the general truths and approaches that we wouldn't find in other texts, because they're consistent and they layer on each other. But the fact that there are specific things in there, the specific issues that are addressed, are really helpful.
So these same two letters we have, they would have been shared with other churches.
Yeah, so
we're probably similar to the Corinthians.
Yeah, so typically what happened, this is my understanding of it, Paul wrote, there's one copy of the letter, right, that Paul sends to Corinth. Eventually somebody reads it, they're like, man, this thing is fire, like let's make some copies of this. And then the other churches in other areas, right, they're like, hey, is there a way, could we pay to get a copy of the letter that Paul wrote you, and we'll trade it for a copy. The Galatians are like, well, we'll trade you for a copy of what he wrote us. And we know there are other letters, like I think it's in Colossians that Paul's like, hey, when you're done reading this letter, share it with the church in Laodicea and make sure you read the letter that I sent them. We don't have a copy of that letter. So in the early years of the Christian movement, these letters from Paul and other Christian leaders, especially the letters that really hit home, right? That resonated, and they were like, oh man, like the people in Ephesus, they need to read. This is just as applicable to them as it is to us here. They became useful in the life of the church. I mean, since they kind of like went viral, is what they would say today, right? The youths today would say that. So copies would be made, and people realized like, wow, the Spirit of God is speaking to us through these copies. And eventually, like there were lots of these copies that are going around. They started coming together in different collections. And then what began to really solidify stuff is the church began to undergo systematic persecution by the Roman Empire at different stages. And one of the things that they would do is they would come to the church leaders and be like, hand over your sacred scriptures. So then it became a question of what's worth dying for? What's worth not handing over? So I'm sure there were churches that were like, I got this letter to First Clement, like it's good, but it's probably not, we're like, here, this is all we've got, take this. And they're hiding the other ones at the back. And that's kind of how most people think that the Christian canon came together. Like there were some criteria that they used to think about it. Like, was it written by an apostle or by someone who was close to an apostle, right? Like the Gospel of Mark, they believe that Peter kind of informed that. Did it contradict the teachings of God? That's why things like, the Gospel of Thomas and things like that were written somewhere in the same neighborhood, like didn't get included because they ran contrary to the truth that we find in other scriptures. And then it was like, what was generally viewed as being valuable in lots of different places and lots of different times. And it came together, and, that like, it's a little bit, and then, eventually, and I don't remember what it was, one of the councils, they were like, here are the 26 letters of the the 26 books of the New Testament. But it's not like there was this like smoky back room with a bunch of guys saying like, all right, well, let's put Paul's letters in, but like, I don't like the Gospel of Thomas because it talks about Mary Magdalene and real positive. Let's get rid of that. We don't want, there wasn't any sort of like sinister plot like the Da Vinci Code kind of puts out. And somebody described it this way, said, the church councils didn't discover the New Testament canon any more than Isaac Newton created gravity, right? The apple fell and hit him on the head, and he's like, oh, I guess there's a thing called gravity. And the church just kind of, by the time the canon came together, it's like, this is what most churches in most places view as being really inspired by God and used by his Spirit to teach us. So let's just kind of put our stamp of approval on that. They were recognizing a fact that God had kind of helped bring about and develop.
Chronologically, was this early in the early church or in the middle?
These books, First and Second Corinthians, like they're in the early 50s. I think most people believe that Galatians was one of the earlier letters that Paul wrote. That was like late 30s, early 40s. Paul is dead by the early 60s, so his letters are done. The latest of the New Testament writings, I believe, were, John, the book of Revelation, his gospel, somewhere around 90 AD. So most of the texts that we have in the New Testament were written or pieced together somewhere between like the mid 30s and like the early 90s, that sort of 55, 60-year period. That's what I had for tonight. So again, the goal is not to plumb the mysteries of all the different texts and things that are in there. We may do that more. I just really wanted to give a little more of an introduction to who wrote it, who received it, kind of what's the length of the relationship they have, with the idea that that can help you as you're reading through it to be more engaged in that study. A couple of things to be aware of. So this handout that I gave you, and if you're watching online, by the way, you can contact Dana, office@suburbanchurch.com, and she can email you the PDF of this. So one side of it is just some general orienting information about the book. Comes from a really great book called How to Read the Bible Book by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. A really great New Testament and Old Testament scholar. They just have short, like 5 or 6 page introductions to each book of the Bible, gives you specific guidelines, advice on how to read it, what to pay attention to. And then the backside are just other resources. If you are wanting to dig more deeply and dig into it more deeply, there's some things to be aware of. I've got copies of a lot of these up here. One of them is that book by Ben Witherington, A Week in the Life of Corinth, which is kind of a fun fictional read, but it does sort of give you at least his perspective on like, man, what was life in the first century like? And what kinds of things did people think about and wrestle with and all of that. Then there's a number of different commentaries that I enjoy from different series and sort of different levels of whether they're written for a popular audience or whether they're super technical and academic and all of that. And then just would point out, again, the Bible Project videos. And again, one of the things that I think is so great about the YouVersion app, if you have that on your phone, they have, I don't know, like 1,000 translations of the Bible in a whole bunch of different languages. Maybe it's not quite 1,000 yet, but they've got a bunch. And a lot of them are in English. And a number of the English versions have audio versions of them. So it's really helpful to some people like to read, other people do better listening, but you can just listen to the letters because, the first people that read it, they listened to it. So it's good to it's a way to just sort of engage with the text. So yeah, here, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and then, if